Never in history has an American in uniform held such enormous power, and General Douglas MacArthur enjoys it enormously. Under the paradoxical MacArthur, America's once bitter enemy emerges as a greater power. The Japanese and MacArthur bring out the best in each other.
Power, immense power, granted to few men since the first Caesar, falls into the hands of General Douglas MacArthur, overlord of Japan. Too much power for any ordinary man. But MacArthur is no ordinary man. He is ready for it, and he knows the pitfalls. He reflects. Because I had been given so much power, I was faced with the most difficult situation of my life. I had studied the lives of Alexander and Caesar and Napoleon, and great as these captains were, all had erred when they became leaders of occupation forces. With such hazards as I expected, could I succeed?
Summer of '45. Japan is physically and spiritually shattered. Tens of millions are homeless, destitute, diseased. Help them, MacArthur commands. The plight of one is recalled by the Emperor's interpreter, Ambassador Matsui.
I saw a young boy. I'm sure he had nothing to eat, but his condition was so bad, with diarrhea, his body covered with dirt and so on. And an American officer came patting on the boy's shoulder and said, "Come with me." And he took the boy probably to a hospital, or at least to give him some medical treatment and food. That was what we needed at that time.
MacArthur intends to instill Western-style democracy, a new word and a new idea. Historian Toshio Nishi.
And I think everybody heard democracy at least 100 times a day, but it just passed their ears like this. Food, food, food.
3 million tons of food immediately, the general demands. When Washington hesitates, he cables grimly, "Give me food or give me bullets." MacArthur the enemy becomes MacArthur the savior. MacArthur talks of his sacred duty to heal the people. Behind the walls of his Tokyo headquarters, the general is developing a master plan. He will restructure an entire society to his liking. Biographer William Manchester.
Of course, MacArthur was marvelously suited for the role of an absolute monarch. He adored it. No one to contradict him, no one to argue with him.
MacArthur surrounds himself with devoted advisors, experts who recommend but don't decide policy. His Secretary of Staff, General Frank Sackton.
It required a special person to do this job of rehabilitating a country of 70 million people that had been defeated in battle, and it was, you must remember, in total defeat. It had lost everything, including their god, the emperor, who could no longer be considered a god because the emperor had surrendered.
All culture, all ritual and custom is encompassed by Shintoism. Its center is the emperor. Shintoism glorifies the Japanese warrior race. They had never lost a war. The emperor had always brought victory. Now they realize they have marched and died for a lie.
I think the Japanese people then put their emperor on hold while they turned to General MacArthur as their new god. And this was displayed, at least to me, every day when hundreds would form in front of the Daiichi building to see the general come and go to work, and in order to pay their respects.
MacArthur's critics want the Japanese punished. Instead, he asked the GIs to be kind to their former bitter enemy. MacArthur threatens 5 years in jail for any GI who strikes a Japanese.
I was a member of the 33rd Infantry Division, and my feelings toward the Japanese and the Japanese military was not very happy or pleasant, obviously. They were the enemy. But the interesting thing is that well within a year, my attitude changed. The Japanese won me over. I became convinced the Japanese were a good people and were going to effectuate the surrender terms honestly and faithfully.
In contrast to the occupation in Germany, he encourages contact with the former enemy. He will at times woo the people, at times prod them.
A part of MacArthur enjoyed holding the whip hand over the Japanese, but a part of the Japanese enjoyed feeling the whip. It was a kind of sadomasochistic relationship on a sublime level.
MacArthur draws on his knowledge of Japan at the turn of the century. He's confident he can manipulate tradition, confident the people will obey him, the new overlord.
MacArthur, austere, remote, seemingly aloof, fitted the Japanese concept of what a leader should be.
To the lordly MacArthur, the Japanese are perfect subjects, uncritical admirers.
MacArthur had every marvelous quality, this enormous dignity, this bearing, this magnetism, and gentility. He was very well bred and was a lord of the manor, a king of the domain in every sense of the word, in his actions and the way he spoke. But he was also very vain and very sensitive. It was a sensitivity mortgaged to vanity, and that often defeated him. He couldn't bear criticism.
Japanese newspapers are allowed free political expression, but no criticism of MacArthur.
He appeared as an immense, great man of democracy. And the propaganda was done daily basis. Japanese press, Japanese teachers constantly spewed out the same language MacArthur spoke.
He legalizes trade unions and the Communist Party, horrifying conservative America. MacArthur reasons that banning the communists would make them more popular. Freedom of speech brings protests against the old order. MacArthur views this as the beginning of independent expression, democracy. But it alarms America, which fears the Japanese will go communist. MacArthur himself is denounced as a communist, while the Allies worry that he's a closet fascist on the side of the old warlords. British political analyst Keith Kyle.
And there was a feeling, perhaps, that General MacArthur, as an imperial Caesarian figure, might accommodate himself rather too readily to the hierarchy in Japan, whereas, of course, British people wanted to see the whole thing done away with. We were immensely relieved when General MacArthur's type of imperial grandeur took the form of fundamental reforms.
He seizes bank assets. All profits of the wartime combines belong to the people, he declares. He says, I intend to care for the Japanese people from the cradle to the grave. MacArthur employs many of the old militarists to supervise disarmament, saying they'll do it best. They do it unquestioningly. He breaks the power of the Zaibatsu, the industrial monopolies, by selling their shares to the public. Despite his critics, he's creating not a communist, but a capitalist society. He is rebuilding Japan as a far greater power. The occupation is becoming a one-man show. In theory, Japan is governed by a four-power Allied Council, but MacArthur visits the council only once to deliver a speech.
He was really being very, very false, because there was one line in that speech which says, as we sit in deliberation as the Allied Council for Japan. Well, he had no intention of ever sitting with the Allied Council for Japan, and never did. He appointed Whitney to be his deputy. And his instructions to Whitney were, the Russians are up to no good, and the British, the Australians want to horn in on the show. Keep them in their place. Keep them in their place.
United Nations Organization.
MacArthur wants to stand alone before history as the builder of modern Japan. He personally drafts key sections of the nation's new constitution. It is a revolutionary document. Japan, alone among nations, renounces forever the right to make war.
To accomplish through this Constitution, abolish war as a sovereign right.
The U.S. Consul General in Japan, Alexis Johnson.
It was, in the eyes of, I think, most of us, and certainly of Washington in that, it was fantastically idealistic. And if it had come from some confirmed pacifist, you might be able to understand it. But coming from supposedly the hard-headed MacArthur, it was very, very difficult to understand.
He sees himself as the great reformer, yet remains aloof from everyday life. When he passes through Tokyo, all traffic respectfully halts. He has cast himself as a mystic who knows all and decides all. He writes the new Constitution.
It is with a sense of deep satisfaction that I am today able to announce a decision of the Emperor and the government of Japan to submit to the Japanese people a new and enlightened constitution, which has my full approval.
Emperor Hirohito drives to Parliament to officially approve MacArthur's document. By reading the Constitution, the Emperor demotes himself from the status of a god to a mere figurehead, but he approves every word. MacArthur's will now becomes imperial writ. When the Emperor tells them to adopt democracy, MacArthur knows they'll do it. In an astonishing timetable, free elections come just 7 months after Japan's defeat. MacArthur, a male chauvinist by repute, makes the liberation of women a top priority. He gives them suffrage, and they promptly vote out the old Japan. Moderates triumph. Only 5 communists are elected, proof MacArthur feels of his political astuteness. A housewife, hoeing her vegetables, learns she is now an elected lawmaker. A month before, she had no rights at all. MacArthur becomes Asia's first revolutionary land reformer, ahead of Mao Zedong. Japanese farmers are serfs on family estates. MacArthur calls this slavery. His political advisor, Charles Cadiz.
MacArthur's point was that a peasant without land is like a man without a soul. And he felt very strongly about this. There was nothing in his directive that specifically required a land reform. It was on his own initiative.
90% of Japan's farmland changes hands. A 2-acre plot is sold for the price of a carton of cigarettes.
To tell you the truth, I was one of the victims, because I had a land in the countryside, nice property near the seashore, but it was confiscated.
And MacArthur says, you absentee landlords, you are filthy feudalists, give the land to the peasant, back to the peasants. My father says, okay. My mother says, hold a minute. This is extortion. We stole land from nobody. Why should we give to peasants? They were grateful that we let them cultivate the land. But mother's voice is a whimper in front of MacArthur. So, deal is done. They lost the land. And from the wealth to poverty.
But the sum I received was exact amount of the train fee to go there and to come back to Tokyo. So what the use of going? So I didn't go. It was simply confiscated in a way. But that helped the land to be distributed equally, impartially among the farmers, and that prevented Japan from turning communist. I think this is a great achievement on the part of MacArthur.
And when he was told that the Land Reform Act had been adopted, he looked up toward the ceiling and toward a picture of his father, which hanged on the wall, and said, how am I doing, Dad?
With Shintoism disestablished as a state religion, MacArthur toys with the idea of imposing Christianity. Some sects try to placate him. One offers prayers to General Motors and another to United Fruit. But vain as he is, he will not lead a holy crusade.
I am not trained in ecclesiastical methods, but I did my best. No phase of the occupation has left me with a greater sense of personal satisfaction than my spiritual stewardship. Although I am of Caesar, I did try to render unto God that which is his.
As the Japanese become more Western, MacArthur becomes more imperious. He is seen only on his daily rides between his residence and office. In contrast, the emperor becomes a public figure. He becomes more revered merely by displaying himself, a tremendous thrill for the masses who had been forbidden to gaze upon him.
Hirohito's image changed. You know, there were pictures of him in the paper, fishing and with his children, and he sort of became like the King of Sweden, who rode a bicycle to show he was just folks.
His son and heir, Prince Akihito, enrolls in a private school and is told to make friends. It's difficult. American popular culture sweeps Japan. MacArthur invites Joe DiMaggio to help start a local base-baru league. Even Prince Akihito and the royal princesses are caught up in the craze. Some Japanese petition Congress to make Japan the 49th state.
You had the interface between these two civilizations that could have led to animosity, hostility, bloodshed, but due to the sensitivity with which MacArthur handled it, I think it goes down in history as one of the great historical accomplishments of all time.
After all, when you look back at the very bitter, bloody war we had with the Japanese and the hatred that were generated by that war, we emerged as best friends of the Japanese.
In Japan, he is the supreme soldier, supreme statesman, but he still aspires to greater power and now seeks to rule America itself. In 1948, he bids for the U.S. presidency from 12,000 miles away.
I think very much he wanted to be president, but as always he wrapped himself in these veils of secrecy and glamour and untouchability, so that he never came out for it. But he once said to me something about his popularity in America. He said, "My fan letters," and I looked at him in astonishment because he had very few fan letters. I was responsible for putting his mail on his desk every morning.
MacArthur for president signs appear throughout Japan. He could become president here by acclamation. He assumes it must be the same in America, but he hasn't been home for 11 years.
No man can fail to be profoundly stirred by such a public movement. I can say, and with due humility, that it would be recreant to all my concepts of good citizenship were I to shrink because of the hazards and responsibilities involved from accepting any public duty to which I might be called by the American people.
At the Republican convention, the right wing deserts him. He's become too controversial. The hall is almost empty when his few backers nominate him. He gets only 11 votes.
For the Republican nomination for president.
One of history's also-rans, Thomas Dewey, is chosen. MacArthur, America's greatest war hero, is humiliated. In Tokyo, a MacArthur aide describes the general as being as low as a rug. He is almost 70 and hints he'll retire. But he has his monument. In a mere 5 years, he has created one of the world's most stable and prosperous democracies.
I would say the greatest monument in the world to General MacArthur is Japanese democracy, which is one of the best developed democratic countries in the world, bar none. And instead of growing weaker, it is growing stronger all the time.
Using the foundations of ancient Nippon, he has built a modern state. Under MacArthur, the life expectancy of the average Japanese has increased by 10 years. His health reforms alone have saved 2 million lives, more than Japan's losses in the war.
He was a proconsul, a viceroy in the great tradition. And the Japanese nation today is, to an extraordinary degree, an accomplishment of Douglas MacArthur.
By 1949, Mao prevails in China. As Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist troops abandon the mainland, they publicly execute their communist captives. MacArthur warns repeatedly against communism. He now requests and gets a troop buildup in Asia, but he is terrified of another world war, which even he cannot win.
MacArthur made many statements in respect of his opposition to war. If there was another war, there would be little left of civilization. And he said that even though most of my life has been spent in army camps, and my first recollection is of the sound of a bugle waking me up when I was a young boy. And although I felt great elation on the battlefield because I was responsible for the lives of tens of thousands of men, I always hated it as a detestable experience.
He is 70 years old, the American ruler of Japan, when suddenly called back to war as commander of the world's first United Nations force.
At the call of the bugle, the soldier awakes and rallies to the colors. In June 1950, General Douglas MacArthur hears it once more. This time the bugle cries a telephone ring. War in Korea. He remembers that moment. I had an uncanny feeling of nightmare. It had been 9 years before, on a Sunday morning at the same hour, that a telephone call with the same note of urgency had awakened me in the penthouse atop the Manila Hotel. It was the same fell note of the war cry that was again ringing in my ears. It couldn't be, I told myself, not again. How, I asked myself, could the United States have allowed such a deplorable situation to develop?
June 25, 1950. 90,000 North Korean troops, Soviet-equipped, lunge across the 38th parallel. Washington and its ally South Korea are unprepared. The army breaks and flees. The U.S. sees the invasion as evidence of a global communist threat. For once, Washington and MacArthur agree.
The communist threat is a global one. Its successful advance in one sector threatens the destruction of every other sector. You cannot appease or otherwise surrender to communism in Asia without simultaneously undermining our efforts to halt its advance in Europe.
Korea, just a small remote peninsula divided at the 38th parallel. The two capitals, Seoul and Pyongyang, become confronting camps in the Cold War.
Korea was regarded as insignificant and beyond the defense perimeter of the United States. This had been stated by Dean Acheson, who was our Secretary of State, and also by Douglas MacArthur. It was a tragic miscalculation on the part of the communists. They believed, and with some justification, that the Americans would not contest a conquest of South Korea by North Korea.
Korea's priority in the Cold War changes in 1949 as Mao Zedong conquers all of mainland China. President Truman now fears Sino-Soviet expansionism. He approves a secret policy recommendation to resist communist encroachment anywhere. Unaware of the U.S. combat commitment, North Korea prepares to invade the South, and MacArthur, suddenly called to arms, is shot. He argues too late that Korea is not the place to take a stand.
Thus, step by step, the United States went to war against communism in Asia. I could not help being amazed at the manner in which this great decision was being made. With no submission to Congress, whose duty it is to declare war, and without even consulting the field commander involved, the members of the executive branch of the government agreed to enter the Korean War. All the risks inherent in this decision, including the possibility of Chinese and Russian involvement, applied then just as much as they applied later.
Truman wins the support of the United Nations Security Council for a UN police action. For the first time, the world body will seek to impose its law. British political analyst Keith Kyle.
The feeling in Britain when North Korea invaded South Korea was that this was the test of the United Nations. All through the war, people had spoken of how the League of Nations had lacked teeth, and that the thing above all, which the successor organization had to have, was teeth. In fact, of course, in the Security Council of the United Nations, the permanent members had a veto. And it was only because Russia was sulking in her tent, boycotting the meetings of the Security Council, that it was possible for the United Nations to act with such great speed in the case of Korea.
13 member countries promised troops, and there's no doubt who must lead them. MacArthur, lifetime defender of the Stars and Stripes, is given the blue UN flag as commander of the ill-prepared Allies. In the first week of war, the South Korean army is in mass retreat, having abandoned the capital, Seoul. The first American troops sent in are sufficient only to guard U.S. air bases. The UN war and the new U.S. doctrine of resistance already seem a lost cause. Five days after the invasion, MacArthur flies to Korea to see how he can avert defeat.
MacArthur went into South Korea when the situation was still chaotic and refugees were pouring south. And he was standing on a little hilltop just staring down at this flood of refugees, including demoralized South Korean soldiers. And it was then, he later said, that he conceived of the Incheon landing, far behind the enemy lines.
In that brief interval on that blood-soaked hill, I formulated my plans. They were desperate plans indeed, but I could see no other way unless to accept a defeat which would include not only Korea, but all of continental Asia. Completely outnumbered, I would rely upon strategic maneuver to overcome the great odds against me.
MacArthur doesn't immediately reveal his plan to save Korea. He builds towards it. At first, he requests only 20,000 men. He demands another 50,000 men, but Washington hesitates. It means withdrawing troops from Europe. The Europe First policy has enraged MacArthur ever since Pearl Harbor. Once more, he complains of having to fight with his hands tied. From the start, MacArthur and Truman differ, and it sets them on a collision course. Truman wants a limited war to prove communism can be contained. MacArthur regards war as an evil to be stamped out only through the total defeat of the aggressors. His operations chief in Korea, Major General Edwin Wright.
He always had only one thing in mind. He never conceived. He had no place in his mind for anything except winning. This is absolutely foreign to him to think of anything else. So his approach was always that. His approach was always the offense, never any defense of any kind.
The American tradition has always been that once our troops are committed to battle, the full power and means of the nation would be mobilized and dedicated to fight for victory, rather than stalemate or compromise. Not by the wildest stretch of imagination did I dream that this tradition might be broken.
MacArthur's forces, being pushed toward the sea, try conventional retreat, blowing bridges. To improve morale, MacArthur introduces a buddy system. Each American fights beside a Korean. Surprised by the increased resistance, the North Koreans pause long enough for MacArthur to form a defensive perimeter. "2,000 British soldiers arrive, the vanguard of 40,000 Commonwealth troops, to be followed by French, Turks, Dutch, and Filipinos. They land at Busan, the last port in South Korea. The North Koreans have overrun the rest of the country, except a small corner in the southeast, the Busan perimeter. If it is lost, Busan could become another Dunkirk." Marine Colonel Taplett.
It was bad. The whole perimeter was beginning to cave in, and as I said, when we landed at Busan, the first information we had was that the North Koreans were only about 25 miles from Busan, and the natives that we could see on the docks working, you could see that they were worried. They had this look of despair, fear in their eyes, and we knew that we were going to be thrown into a buzzsaw.
For the men at the front, the wider purpose of the war Be it Truman's police action or MacArthur's anti-red crusade, has ceased to matter. They're fighting now for survival. MacArthur is diverted from the real crisis to a potential one. He's ordered to Formosa to restrain Chiang Kai-shek. Chiang has offered to send 35,000 of his Chinese nationalist troops to Korea. Washington firmly declines, but worries that Chiang might still widen the war by sending his troops into China. MacArthur is told to warn Chiang that the U.S. will block any attempt to invade the mainland.
It was not his decision to go to Formosa which became controversial. It was the way the thing was handled, and he gave the impression that Chiang Kai-shek was an ally and that they were in this together, and Chiang, of course, was a very controversial figure himself.
The sudden huddle between the general and the generalissimo is viewed suspiciously around the world. Two old warlords getting together to plot World War III. Chiang issues a communique implying that MacArthur backs the invasion of China. Washington is frantic.
This was when Truman began worrying about MacArthur's good judgment and about his politics.
To my astonishment, the visit to Formosa and my meeting with Chiang Kai-shek was greeted by a furor. My habitual critics, including those within the United Nations who advocated appeasement of the Soviet Union and Red China, naturally set in with their cudgels. But I was somewhat startled to find myself attacked by certain groups within the United States itself.
MacArthur, as statesman, is a disaster in Washington's eyes. But MacArthur, the general, is still supreme. He now reveals his bold plan for winning the war, a landing at Incheon, far behind enemy lines. Incheon, a small seaport on Korea's northwest coast. Although the closest harbor to occupied Seoul, Incheon is a hazardous target, but it has tactical advantages. Admiral Arleigh Burke.
So he was quite correct in the desirability of having an amphibious attack in Incheon. And Incheon was the only place on the coast where an amphibious landing could really be made, where it was effective and where we could quickly cut the enemy's supply lines.
If you subjected the Incheon landing to a more logical analysis, you could think of all sorts of reasons why it would fail, from the hydrographic conditions to the state of our amphibious shipping to the lack of time for planning to the rather disorganized way that forces have been gathered. Many good reasons for Incheon to fail. But MacArthur's intuition told him it would succeed.
The Joint Chiefs of Staff had agreed to MacArthur planning an amphibious operation. But at that time, they didn't know where it was. And when they found out it was at Incheon, there was a great deal of concern back in Washington because right away they could see the difficulties, you know, the high tides, the mud flats, and all this sort of thing. So General Collins, the Army Chief of Staff, and Admiral Sherman, Chief of Naval Operations, came over to Tokyo to talk to MacArthur and see if this really was something that they could go along with. Because up to this time, there had not been any agreement that we could do it.
For the first time in many years, the Lord of Japan and commander of an international army is called upon to defend his planning. MacArthur's resentment of Washington has never been deeper.
I could almost hear my father's voice telling me, as he had many years ago, Doug, councils of war breed timidity and defeatism.
There were a few questions that were asked by Admiral Sherman and General Collins, and then General MacArthur took over, and for 40 minutes, without a note of any kind, he probably gave one of the finest talks that anybody ever listened to. And at the end of it, it would have been impossible for anybody not to agree with him, although while they didn't know it was too late to stop it even then.
September 15, 1950. MacArthur, aboard his command ship Mount McKinley, watches his fleet of 260 ships move toward Incheon. It's a nerve-wracking passage through the sea channels. Among the naval commanders, the man who got him out of the Philippines, Admiral Buckley.
Here I commanded a destroyer division at that time, went up that channel in the middle of the night there without lights. A very difficult piece of navigation, a very threatening one here since I'd never been in those waters, but we did it. You knew that the day was going to come and that you were going to get into the boats and go.
I think we arrived there sometime around midnight, and we didn't boat until about 5:30, 6 o'clock in the morning, so we were sitting there like sitting ducks, and it was sort of weird to come topside in the ship and look over and see the silhouette of Womido Island and the Incheon Harbor, and it was eerie from the standpoint that it was so quiet.
Within 5 hours, 40,000 men would act boldly in the hope that 100,000 others manning the thin defense lines in South Korea would not die. I alone was responsible for tomorrow, and if I failed, the dreadful results would rest on Judgment Day against my soul.
A veteran Marine commander, Brigadier General Edwin Simmons.
My chief recollection of the Incheon landing was the smoke and the drizzle and the darkness as we approached the beach. And as the waterfront and the city had been bombed and shelled almost incessantly for the last several days, there were fires, and the smoke added to the mist and the slight drizzle sort of cast a grayish-green pall over the whole landing area.
The landing proves dramatic in a way no one expected. Incheon is taken in just a few hours. MacArthur's losses, 500 dead, are relatively light. His troops later trapped 50,000 North Koreans. He has staked his reputation at Incheon. Now he cannot control his relief. He throws up. But he was right.
All of his subordinates said it couldn't be done.
He intuitively knew that the Incheon landing would work and would change the course of the war.
It was absolutely brilliant.
One of the greatest military feats in history.
Is that if it failed, it would be god-awful.
Yet our Joint Chiefs of Staff, they didn't quite approve of the whole thing at the beginning here. They thought it was too bold a move. Again, you're coming right back to the genius of MacArthur. He could see those things. He knew where to put the thrust, where to make the great stroke and terminate the war. Great. No question about it.
Whenever I perform a mission and think I have done it well, I feel I can face up squarely to my dad and say, Governor, what about it?
It's 5 days before MacArthur can go ashore. He shows his customary disregard for danger and spends several hours at the front with his men, at times shot at by snipers. A photographer there, Carl Meidens.
He said during the Incheon landing that this was a great moment in history, and he was doing two things in that Incheon landing. He was winning the war in Korea up to that point, and he was creating great military history. He was aware of it every moment that he was there.
And so I saw General MacArthur stride up to the top of the hill to meet Colonel Lewis Burwell Puller, better known as Chesty Puller, who was then commanding the 1st Marine Regiment. And both of these persons were consummate actors, and they were both playing the role to the hilt. MacArthur was in full costume, the crushed hat, the sunglasses, the leather jacket, the faded but carefully pressed khaki trousers. And you know, the curious thing is that he, General MacArthur, so dominated that scene, although there were many other notables and dignitaries in the party. The only person of whom I have a definite impression, other than Colonel Fuller, is General MacArthur. He completely dominated the scene.
Through his classic move at Incheon, MacArthur frees all of South Korea in 15 days. His besieged force at Busan breaks out and joins up with the Incheon invaders. Seoul, the capital, is retaken in 9 days. MacArthur has freed and secured the South, or so it seems. He stages a victory parade in Seoul.
The operation for the re-entry of President Rhee was somewhat more complicated and somewhat more detailed than the Incheon landing, and much more carefully rehearsed. We had fought for the city and we had won it, and then 2 days later, General MacArthur did arrive, landing at Kimpo Airfield, and a procession of limousines and other vehicles had been assembled. And part of it was that we Americans were to stay out of sight. We were to provide a cordon of protection and security along the march route, but we were not to be too visible. Chiefly visible would be the cheering Koreans welcoming their president home.
MacArthur has become accustomed to the personal grandeur of restoring heads of state in the Philippines, in Japan, now in South Korea. He enters the legislative chamber with Syngman Rhee, arm in arm, recites the Lord's Prayer, then hands over the reins of the Republic to the old dictator.
President Rhee seemed deeply moved by it all. He rose and clasped my hand. "We admire you," he said, with tears flowing down his cheeks. "We love you as the savior of our race."
But it isn't over. MacArthur is determined that the North must be defeated and Korea reunited. He wants total victory. This has always been his code. It will now be his downfall.
And when the ceremony was over, the people of Seoul lined the streets and clapped and waved their little paper flags. I returned to Tokyo.
General Douglas MacArthur, hero of the Pacific, overlord of Japan, is at the height of his fame. He appears to have won the Korean War. President Harry S. Truman, free world leader, breaker of the Berlin blockade. His nickname is Give 'em Hell Harry. They meet for the first and last time. Both feel confident, secure. Suddenly, the Chinese invade Korea. A bitter feud develops between the general and the president. Truman decides MacArthur must go. He says, "The son of a bitch isn't going to resign on me. I want him fired."
General MacArthur, now winning the war in Korea, is summoned to meet the man who will soon be his downfall. He recalls the meeting. As I shook hands with Mr. Truman, he remarked, "I've been a long time meeting you, General." I replied, "I hope it won't be so long next time." but there was never to be a next time.
October 1950. They meet on Wake Island, a dot in the mid-Pacific. MacArthur greets his commander-in-chief with a handshake, man to man. MacArthur's assured arrogance usually intimidates everyone, but Truman is not overwhelmed. Truman biographer Robert Donovan.
MacArthur was rather a lordly man. Truman was a very earthy and basically rather humble man. So he had sort of a personal dislike for MacArthur's style, let us say. But I think he always trusted MacArthur as a military commander.
After MacArthur's brilliant landing at Incheon and the advance of his main force from Busan, he has regained the capital, Seoul, and swept his enemy out of South Korea. The United Nations Army has crossed the 38th parallel, closing in on North Korea's capital, Pyongyang. But MacArthur's orders are to stop at the Yalu River, the border with China. Like the earlier communist crossing of the parallel, the UN crossing has escalated the Cold War. For the first time, communist territory has been invaded, without regard to China's reaction. Crossing the parallel is not MacArthur's decision, but he will have to bear the responsibility. Biographer William Manchester.
Most people believe that he voluntarily, on his own initiative, crossed the 38th parallel and invaded North Korea. That is totally untrue. He was the United Nations commander, and the United Nations General Assembly instructed MacArthur to invade North Korea and to unify all of Korea up to the Yalu River.
The UN imposed just two limitations on MacArthur: no aircraft over Chinese airspace and only South Korean troops to be used near the China border. To the Chinese, it seems that the entire UN army is advancing on the Yalu, but at the Wake Island meeting, all seems well. Washington tells MacArthur to proceed and let action determine the matter.
When Harry Truman met MacArthur at Wake Island after Incheon, Truman asked MacArthur if the Chinese would come into the war. Well, MacArthur always had an opinion on everything, even when he wasn't qualified to have one, and so he said he didn't think they'd come in. And thereafter, Truman always said that it was MacArthur who had deceived him by saying the Chinese wouldn't come into the war.
Now Truman basks in the glory of his victorious commander. He pins a Distinguished Service Cross on the general. 6 months later, he will regret not having fired him. An elated MacArthur returns to Tokyo, for once showing his excitement in public. He assumes he has a free hand. The way is clear. He can proceed with Truman's blessing. For the UN commander and his troops, the war is going well. As MacArthur's forces push deeper into North Korea, he savors the easy victories. He visits the front once again, taking personal charge of a risky parachute landing that brings the fall of the North Korean capital. Buoyed by success, the Allies worry even less about Chinese retaliation. The UN forces boldly advance to the northernmost part of Korea. But the conditions they face are changing rapidly. Marine Commander Colonel Robert Taplett.
fighting in the reservoir in North Korea was so much different from fighting down on the southern perimeter and in the area around Incheon, Seoul, primarily because it was wintertime and the terrain itself was much more rugged. It was easy to ambush troops, it was easy to set up roadblocks.
MacArthur, nearing China's border, has orders to use only South Korean troops. But thirsting for early victory, he orders American troops to advance. China issues warnings, which go unheeded. The British UN delegate, Lord Gladwin.
We were told, of course, by Sardar Panikar, the Indian ambassador in Peking, that after a time, of course, when we got beyond the parallel, that the Chinese would be likely to come into war if the American forces went much further. And people didn't take enough notice of that warning, which he'd received, I think, from Zhou Enlai himself. And I don't think even my government really attached enough importance to that. Otherwise, they might have made more fuss about going further north towards the Yalu River than they did.
October 26. The first Chinese troops cross the Yalu River. Another 500,000 are massed along the border. MacArthur continues his advance despite contact with the Chinese. Marine Commander General Edwin Simmons.
We were acting as though we were pursuing a defeated enemy. And while the North Korean army was defeated and fragmented, this was certainly not the case of the Chinese army. And MacArthur and his headquarters in Tokyo were very slow in admitting that the Chinese had entered the war. MacArthur had made the statement that it was now too late for the Chinese to intervene effectively in the war. We were taking prisoners, Chinese prisoners, and yet at the Singfi headquarters in Tokyo, they were denying that these were bona fide Chinese prisoners. They said, no, they're Chinese nationals serving in the North Korean army. Well, we knew this wasn't the case because we knew the uniforms, we knew the identification papers we were taking off the prisoners. And we would hear this through shortwave radio in the evening, and it caused us a rather cynical view of General MacArthur's headlong plunge towards the Yalu.
As more Chinese cross the Yalu, engaging in large-scale battle, MacArthur finally realizes what he is up against. He makes a fateful decision to bomb the Yalu bridges. He tells Washington,
"Up to now, I had avoided doing so because of the danger of accidentally missing the targets and dropping bombs in Manchuria, which had been forbidden." An immediate dispatch came from Secretary of Defense Marshall, countermanding my order and directing me to postpone all bombing of targets within 5 miles of the Manchurian border. It would be impossible to exaggerate my astonishment, and I at once protested.
Washington gives in, permitting MacArthur to bomb the bridges, but only on the Korean side. MacArthur again protests.
One of these bomber pilots, wounded unto death, the stump of an arm dangling by his side, gasped at me. Through the bubbles of blood he spat out, "General, which side are Washington and the United Nations on?" It seared my very soul.
Frustrated, he writes his resignation, then tears it up. But his losing battle with Washington has begun. Mysteriously, the Chinese disappear. MacArthur takes the incredible risk of flying along the river in his unarmed plane. For 2 weeks, the Yalu River is quiet. MacArthur's troops celebrate Thanksgiving with a false sense of security. The UN force of 100,000 men is ready for a final offensive to control the Yalu and end the war. The day after Thanksgiving, the Chinese spring their gigantic trap. 300,000 of them swoop down from the mountains, attacking along a 300-mile front. MacArthur tries to continue his assault, but he finally radios Washington, "We face an entirely new war." MacArthur has blundered. British political analyst Keith Kyle.
He was absolutely and supremely confident. And it was because he did not take the proper precautions as a general that he got defeated. The fault was entirely his. And because he was such a great general, he was greatly blamed when he failed.
The rollback in North Korea was the worst defeat the United States had ever suffered in its military history up to that time. And there was a great danger that we might get involved with a war in China. And China had a mutual defense assistance pact with the Soviet Union that raised the threat of the Soviet Union coming in on the side of China. So that was a very serious moment in American history indeed.
In Washington, Truman compounds the uncertainties. He proclaims that communist aggression must be thrown back, yet he rejects MacArthur's requests to bomb China. Truman hints at a truce, yet tells the press he may use all America's power to contain the Chinese. The British Prime Minister, Clement Attlee, rushes to Washington. Suddenly, the UN police action in Korea threatens to become a real world war. They've all miscalculated.
Is to align our policies
Both UN and American resolve is crumbling. Surrounded by the Chinese and in danger of being overwhelmed, MacArthur has no choice. He must retreat back into South Korea. Marine Commander Colonel Wesley Noren.
There were monumental adversities of terrain, weather, and an organized, resolute enemy, particularly in the winter, when temperatures fell to possibly 20 below zero and stayed there. Troops had to carry on their backs what they needed to survive, sometimes for days on end. How do you resupply these troops on the top of an icy hill when they're being attacked? What do you do with wounded when they'll freeze to death if they lie there for more than a few minutes? These problems were met, and they were met by this unusual and common heroism that characterized the operations, particularly in the winter.
And I guess the worst part of fighting up there was that we were not too well equipped with cold weather gear. And although we had casualties from the tremendous number of Chinese we ran into, we suffered a tremendous amount of weather casualties that should have been unnecessary if we'd been properly equipped. We had Chinese prisoners that would come in walking on the stump instead of their ankle or foot. There'd just be a stump left, and bloody, blue, full of ice. So they suffered probably much more than we did.
MacArthur, proud of his low casualty record, is now forced to take heavy losses. Though he's under heavy duress, blamed for the diplomatic and military disaster, he still manages to organize a masterful retreat. His two armies fight their way to the seaports. After naval evacuation, the port installations are blown up. December 1950. MacArthur gets a new field commander, General Matthew B. Ridgway. Ridgway has made it known that he obeys political orders. Like MacArthur, he is flamboyant, aggressive. In action, he always wears 2 hand grenades.
The main factor in enabling us to move north after operations there in the winter of 1950, I think, was the massive spirit that was imbued in the whole 8th Army by General Ridgway.
General Ridgway, in my mind, accomplished one of the truly great military feats of all time in turning an army which was demoralized and in retreat, turning it around and making a stand. And he did so in spite of, I would say, of MacArthur and MacArthur's attitude at that time.
MacArthur continues to wage diplomatic war with the White House. At Christmas, when the Chinese launch a major offensive, the Joint Chiefs ask for his recommendations. He replies,
"We could firstly blockade the coast of China. Secondly, destroy, through naval gunfire and aerial bombardment, Chinese industrial capacity to wage war. Thirdly, secure reinforcements of the nationalist garrison on Formosa to strengthen our position in Korea if we decide to continue the fight for that peninsula. And finally, release existing restrictions upon the Formosan garrison for diversionary action possibly leading to counter-invasion against vulnerable areas of the Chinese mainland."
Truman is shocked. Bombing and invading China could lead to World War III. The president leaks a report suggesting that MacArthur has deceived him. MacArthur is now made to look wholly responsible for all the Allied misfortune.
"I am the victim of one of the most scandalous propaganda efforts to pervert the truth in modern times. Any impression that as United Nations commander, I am more than an agent to implement policies determined upon at a much higher level is fantastic."
MacArthur's situation was an impossible one. He could not mount a major attack. He had to remain on the defensive. Those were his instructions. And he was confronted with a situation in which UN soldiers were dying every day and no end in sight. And so MacArthur had to protest.
I think that Marine Corps respect for MacArthur began to grow at about this point and through the spring of 1951 as MacArthur argued for a winning of the war. This was something that Marines could understand. What the Marines could not understand was fighting a war in which there was no intention of winning. In fact, you can say that there's perhaps something immoral about asking people to fight and possibly die in a war in which there's no national intent to win.
The Army brass descend on Korea to investigate. They conclude MacArthur has been exaggerating the difficulties. No more troops are needed. Washington ceases to listen to MacArthur. On March 20th, Truman drafts a truce proposal. MacArthur reads a copy. On his own, he announces that he is ready to confer with the Chinese, but he laces his statement with taunts and warnings. This sabotages Truman's proposal.
That was a statement just drenched with diplomatic significance, not the field of MacArthur, and it threw the whole United States, United Nations effort to get a truce off the track. While the president was simmering over this one, MacArthur wrote his famous letter to Joe Martin.
Congressman Joe Martin has declared that if Truman is not out to win in Korea, he should be indicted for the murder of American boys. MacArthur writes a letter seemingly endorsing this statement. MacArthur has gone too far. The president summons his chief advisors, and they all agree that MacArthur must go. The general is to be informed by a special envoy the next day, but there is concern MacArthur might beat them to the punch.
MacArthur might already learn what was afoot, and therefore, as they feared, as any White House staff would fear, MacArthur would come in and say, I am resigning my command.
Truman said, he's not going to be allowed to resign. I'm going to fire the son of a bitch.
Truman decides he must act immediately and calls a midnight press conference.
A number of events have made it evident that General MacArthur did not agree with that policy. I have therefore considered it essential to relieve General MacArthur so that there would be no doubt or confusion as to the real purpose and aim of our policy.
The Truman broadcast is heard in Tokyo. The MacArthurs are told the news by family friends. Kira Huff.
The fact that he got the news over the radio, I always felt was almost unforgivable. It shouldn't have happened that way. And he didn't get it officially first.
MacArthur receives his official dismissal a day later. He seems unprepared for what he calls public humiliation after 52 years in the Army. He later reflects,
without a hearing, without an opportunity for defense, with no consideration for the past. No office boy, no charwoman, no servant of any sort would have been dismissed with such callous disregard for the ordinary decencies.
For the last time, MacArthur goes to the headquarters where he has ruled Japan for 6 years. Our people, says Japan's Prime Minister, look upon the general with the profoundest veneration.
I'll never forget the morning we left. That route was lined with Japanese people. Many of them weeping, not cheering, but crying, and carrying little signs, "We love you, General MacArthur," and things like that that, you know, made you feel, tore your heart out, really.
At Tokyo Airport, UN forces provide the honor guard, though actually the Allies are gloating. The French praise Truman for acting on behalf of the world's people. At the 38th parallel, British officers celebrate, though not for long. 60% of Korea's UN casualties come in the 2 years after MacArthur's recall. America's hysteria will soon envelop him. But for the moment, the battle passions of half a century are spent. He hasn't seen his country for 14 years. Now he has but one thought.
Jeannie, we're going home at last.
After 14 long years, General MacArthur comes home. Preceded by Mrs. MacArthur and followed by 13-year-old son Arthur, the hero of the Pacific debarks at San Francisco to deafening cheers.
He tells his son Arthur, "Well, my boy, we're home," and Arthur is awed. He has never seen America. The Americans haven't seen the mighty MacArthur in person in a generation. A family friend, Kira Huff.
The tremendous welcome he received, and he just couldn't understand it. He said to Admiral Radford, "Do you think they're sorry for me?"
They love, they need the legend. They're furious at the president who sullied it. Journalists who covered his battles recall his homecoming.
Mostly Truman was burned in effigy. He was denounced. Longshoremen walked off their jobs in New York.
Well, I was in an officers' club in Munich, and the officers in there reacted as though they wanted to form a posse and go to Washington and lynch Truman. It was probably the most unpopular thing anybody ever did.
The New York Journal-American, a Hearst paper, suggested that Truman had been injected by a, quote, neural anodyne, unquote, by a State Department agent. That gives you some idea of what went on in the wake of this firing. One Southern senator said that he didn't know what was going on in other parts of the country, but his region was in near hysteria.
The political passion is unmatched since the Civil War. In Washington, the Joint Chiefs who agreed to fire MacArthur now offer a placatory welcome. Elsewhere, flags are at half-mast. A logger tries to drown his mate, and a married couple end up in jail after arguments over who's right, the president or MacArthur. A Gallup poll favors MacArthur 70%. The usually buoyant Truman is grim. He's booed in public. He knows that despite their past show of amity, the general intends to duel, knows he covets the presidency. Now MacArthur is to receive a rare honor, addressing a joint session of Congress. Truman connives to get an advance text and calls it 100% bullshit. Now, with television, the whole nation is exposed to MacArthur's oratory. He is 71, but radiates strength.
The world has turned over many times since I took the oath on the plain at West Point, and the hopes and dreams have long since vanished. But I still remember the refrain of one of the most popular barrack ballads of that day, which proclaimed most proudly that old soldiers never die. They just fade away. And like the old soldier of that ballad, I now close my military career and just fade away. An old soldier who tried to do his duty as God gave him the light to see that duty. Goodbye.
Like the old soldier on the ballad, I am just going to fade away. Goodbye. And I could hear shouts on the floor. No, 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 no.
Congressman Dewey Short of Missouri said, "We have heard the voice of God today, God in the flesh."
And Joe Martin said later that when MacArthur had finished, there wasn't a dry eye on the Democratic side of the House, nor a dry seat on the Republican side. I couldn't put it better.
It's MacArthur Day in New York. The big town makes it a five-star welcome for the five-star hero of the Pacific. The world's greatest city says, "Welcome home," with the greatest demonstration in its history. Mrs. MacArthur and young Arthur share with him the cheers of the multitude. The veritable blizzard of paper is a full measure of New York's enthusiasm.
His motorcade through Manhattan takes 7 hours. Millions of New Yorkers roar themselves into near exhaustion, screaming, "Give 'em hell and don't take it, Mac." Tin Pan Alley grinds out 5 new versions of an old ballad.
Old soldiers never die, never die, never die. Old soldiers never die. They just fade away.
But not MacArthur. He has a duel to finish, a political crusade to begin. His dismissal has forced a Senate hearing. Trying to strike back, he testifies for 3 days without even a lunch break. He tells the senators,
"No more subordinate soldier has ever worn the American uniform. I would repudiate any concept that I wouldn't carry out any order that was given me. Any insinuation by anyone, however high his office, that I have ever in any way failed to the level of my ability to carry out my instructions is completely unworthy and unwarranted.
The general hammers at the immorality of soldiers dying in Korea unless total victory is sought. He urges going into North Korea. Truman witnesses spend 7 weeks rebutting him, but the hearings are a standoff. The war is shown to be a muddle, while MacArthur's ideas seem dated and dangerous, especially to the Allies. Political analyst Keith Kyle.
And so there was immense relief, really, when President Truman used his power of dismissing MacArthur, because quite frankly, I think most British people had thought it was impossible that an American president would have had any longer any power to touch the man.
A U.S. diplomat on MacArthur's Far East staff, Alexis Johnson.
I don't think that he gave the president any choice to do other than what he did. He directly challenged him publicly and privately and in every other way, and directly showed his disdain for the president as the president.
Privately, Truman calls him a coward who ran away from Corregidor. That's unjust. MacArthur duels more generously, saying,
"The little bastard had guts to fire me, and I like him. Judging from the way he handled me, he'd make a pretty good fullback."
His old Filipino friend, Carlos Romulo, tries to reason with him, saying, "You were the man on the spot. You knew what should have been done." MacArthur nods in agreement. "You would have won the war." A vigorous nod, but Romulo tells him, "You were wrong to defy the president." MacArthur just stares. He does not wish to hear logic. He's hearing the summons of the people. Throughout 1951, he crisscrosses America, denouncing communism, appeasement in Korea, and Truman. The frustrations of Korea draw the public to him at first.
The inertia that exists. There is no policy. There is nothing, I tell you. No plan or anything. Your cumulative losses are going to be staggering. It isn't just dust that's settling in Korea. It's American blood. The people have it in their power to stamp out communist influence, which has played so ill-famed a part in the past direction of our public administration. Our country will then reassume that spiritual and moral leadership recently lost in a quagmire of political ineptitude.
His crusading speeches become ever shriller.
Policies are leading towards a communist state with as dreadful certainty as though the leaders of the Kremlin were charting the course.
MacArthur believes the people totally share his views.
MacArthur, MacArthur, we want you for president. You'll solve the housing problem, you won't tax every cent. MacArthur for president.
Truman, tired, vilified, announces he will not seek re-election. But now another rival emerges, Dwight D. Eisenhower, MacArthur's one-time aide. The Republican Convention, Chicago, July '52. Though not an official candidate, MacArthur has a deal with Eisenhower's main challenger, Robert Taft. If Taft wins on the first ballot, he'll name MacArthur as his running mate. If he loses, he'll support MacArthur's nomination. MacArthur's White House hopes depend on the speech he's now to give.
And I was at that convention that night that MacArthur delivered the keynote in an aura of expectation that he might try to stampede that convention with his great oratory, such as he delivered in Congress, and wind up with a nomination.
For once, he has shed his uniform. He looks presidential, but he gives the worst speech of his career, banal, wretchedly delivered. The delegates become restless, chatting, not listening. Eisenhower is acclaimed, and a general becomes president.
They had a feeling that Eisenhower was a democratic, I'm putting it in the small terms, a democratic man, whereas MacArthur had a very regal way about him and a very military way.
Soon after MacArthur visits his former aide, he hands him a long memo on foreign policy, telling him,
"This is the last time I shall call you Ike and speak to you on equal terms. Hereafter you will be Mr. President. So now I say that you have the opportunity to be perhaps the greatest man since Jesus Christ, as only you can dictate the peace of the world. I beg of you to take the initiative with bold action."
Ike tucks the memo into his breast pocket and merely says, "God bless you." MacArthur is never invited to the Eisenhower White House. The old general has become an unwelcome reminder of the simpler pre-atomic past when great warriors mattered. A year later, with the Korean War over, he tells newsmen how he would have ended it all.
Of all the campaigns of my life, 20 major ones to be exact, the one I felt most sure of was the one I was deprived of waging. I could have won the war in Korea in a maximum of 10 days with considerably fewer casualties than were suffered during the so-called truce period, and it would have altered the course of history. Between 30 and 50 atomic bombs would have more than done the job. Dropped under cover of darkness, they would have destroyed the enemy's air force on the ground and wiped out his maintenance and his airmen.
MacArthur is no elder statesman. The public, ever fickle, now ceases to listen to him. He spends his last decade politically in the cold. The MacArthurs live in a penthouse suite at New York's Waldorf Astoria, where 30 years before he'd been ordered off the dance floor for wearing his spurs. The Waldorf is not his dream house, nor the White House with rural picket fence that Jean quietly longs for. But she remains always his loyal soldier. Arthur visits West Point, his father's Mecca, and tries on a cadet's hat. It doesn't fit. It never will. He'll become a professional musician and change his name so as to be his own man. MacArthur, the hero, is not forgotten. Though he publicly changes his mind, renouncing atomic weapons, he has lost too much credibility. He remains a legend, as Carlos Romulo reminds a still bitter Harry Truman.
After President Truman retired, he invited me to his library in Independence, Missouri. So I went and he took me around his library until we saw on the table, one of the tables, a magazine with MacArthur's picture on the cover. So with a gleam in his eye, President Truman said to me, "There is God himself." And I said, "Mr. President, at least in the Philippines we think so."
This year I returned to the scene of some of our greatest days, the Philippines. And never will I forget when that great jet airplane rolled to a stop, and they stretched out before me a red carpet, at the foot of which was the most beautiful Filipino girl I ever saw. And I never felt younger than when she put a garland of flowers around my neck and kissed my cheek and said, "Welcome, General, welcome to the Philippines." And then suddenly all the years of Methuselah settled on my shoulders when she added, "Have you ever been here before?"
But 2 million others in Manila remember and gather round him. He is the embodiment of Filipino history.
My life has been interwoven with yours for nearly 60 years. Even as I hail you, I must say farewell. I must admit with a sense of sadness that the deepening shadows of my life cast doubt upon my ability to pledge again, I shall return.
His 80th birthday, 1960. The new president, John F. Kennedy, admires MacArthur.
When President Kennedy invited him to the White House to honor him, MacArthur looked around and said, I should have lived in this house.
The old soldier now believes that wars of intervention have become too dangerous. MacArthur always abhorred war, but when forced to wage it, he saw it mystically. Good had to triumph over evil, totally. But he knew at the end that his romanticized world was no more. The weapons for good had themselves become another evil.
The soldier, above all other people, prays for peace, for he must suffer and bear the deepest wounds and scars of war. But always in our ears ring the ominous words of Plato, that wisest of all philosophers. Only the dead have seen the end of war.
The man was a riddle and an enigma. And I did not wind up liking him, but I did wind up admiring him, and I concluded that he was the greatest general this country has produced.
1964. MacArthur enters Walter Reed Army Hospital in Washington, age 84, still wearing his varsity A, won at West Point. He sinks rapidly and dies April 3rd. Always he had the gift or the curse of being the storm center, his very name evoking extremes of passion. So it would be in death.
I think he was a tremendously great, if not the greatest American.
He sensed himself as important.
MacArthur was a man who was completely self-confident. He was born that way.
Here lies the greatest actor of all time.
I think underneath it all, he was